What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we're going to be talking about the German black thrash band Nocturnal. I'm personally a huge blackened thrash fan, and I particularly love Nocturnal because I think they just have such a pure and well-executed take on blackened thrash that results in some really good albums. Nocturnal were formed in 2000 by their guitarist, who goes by the name Avenger. They released a couple demos, a couple EPs, and a couple splits in the early 2000s before releasing their 2005 debut, Arrival of the Carnivore. When discussing Nocturnal's sound, Avenger has said he kind of thinks as Nocturnal more of as a thrash band that does thrash in the traditional German vein as opposed to a blackened thrash band. And I think I can kind of understand where he's coming from, especially with this album. This album definitely feels like old school thrash metal, just with a little bit of black metal coming in from the imagery and the vocals. And there's also influences from different facets of old school metal, even outside of the blackened realms. Satanic Oath, I think, is a good example of that. This song just has really frantic energy about it. It almost sounds like a blackened version of like Motorhead. Preventive War is another song, I think, that has some eclectic influences. It's almost got a bit of a punkier feel. It's got some croakier and faster vocals. It almost feels like blackened crossover thrash, which is pretty cool. Burn This Town kind of has similar vibes with a gang vocal chorus. That said, there are definitely some pure blackened thrash moments on here, particularly the first proper track, Temples of Sin, which has these melodic riffs. And the song as a whole just kind of sounds like a mix of Disaster and Aura Nor, which I think is actually a pretty good description of Nocturnal's sound overall. The sound here on this album is really belligerent. There's only a handful of riffs per song. The songs are pretty stripped down. They just kind of barrel forward, they pummel you, and get out of the way. All the songs are pretty short, pretty sweet. And the production is pretty rough around the edges. The guitar tone in particular is pretty abrasive, which I like. You know, that said, there are a couple issues I have with this album. There are a lot of fun songs here, but there's not really any amazing tracks that just blow me away quite like there are in their other albums. One exception is Victorious Night, which has this really glorious melodic riff that I just love. But even with that song, it's a little bit repetitive and a little bit long, which is kind of weird because a lot of the other songs on here are pretty short. In terms of vocals, they had an individual named Mayhem doing vocals who has also performed in Witchburner. He does like a garbled rasp, which is fine, but I definitely prefer the vocals on their later albums. Overall, though, this is a really good album. It's short, it's really punchy. There's enough variety to keep it from sounding homogenous, particularly like the mid-tempo sections in the song Merciless Murder, which offer a nice little break from the thrashiness. Music like this just sounds so authentic and so timeless. This could have come out in 1999. It could have come out yesterday. It could have come out, in 1995. There's just a very timeless quality to music like this, and particularly with this album. It's such a blast to listen to, even if I think they would improve on their future albums. I'll put it here for now, and we'll see how that shakes out. Alright, so the band would return in 2009 with the album Violent Revenge. Nocturnal definitely take their time between releases, but I think that pays off, particularly here because Violent Revenge, point blank, kicks ass. The sound here is a lot more cunning. It feels like they've just honed their sound to a deadlier point, and a lot of that comes from the vocals. They got a new vocalist for this album, a woman named Tyrannizer, and her rasp is just absolutely ferocious. Her vocal performance is one of my favorites in the entire blackened thrash genre. There's so much conviction in the way she says some of these lyrics. The production, likewise, just emphasizes these really roaring guitars, and everything here in terms of the production just sounds a little bit more distinguishable. The drums are really clear. You have kind of this pongy snare sound that's really fitting for the old school sound. And in terms of songwriting, the songs are still straightforward here, but the riffs are generally better, and the songs are generally catchier. I think you really hear that in songs like Atomic Warfare, which is just an amazing blackened thrash track. It's got these really groovy riffs, and just such a venomous vocal performance from Tyrannizer. It's so simple, but it works so well, and it has these subtle rhythmic shifts that just really make for an outstanding track. Disgracer is another amazing song. Something about the riffs and vocal patterns just sound extra vicious here. And Creation of the Possessed is another really cool track. It's got a bouncy riff and an addictive chug that makes it stand out, and just it makes for a really killer track. The overall structure of the album is just really good too. A lot of the songs here just kind of complement each other. Beast of Hades, for example, has kind of a mid-tempo break at the beginning, which gives a little bit of variety. Dark Rat Eyes is another song that definitely feels a bit different than the others. It's got a bit of a groovier feel to it, and it's also a bit longer. In fact, I think a little too long. This is one of the tracks where I feel like they could have shortened it a little bit, and it would have made things a little stronger. Hell's Forces is another track I like a lot. It's got some crossover vibes, like a couple of the tracks on the previous album. It's also got a cool scream-along chorus to it, though I would have liked to hear some gang vocals here. But, other than those minor quibbles I have about individual songs, I really don't have much bad stuff to say about this album. The first time I heard Violent Revenge, I was like, okay, this is a cool black and thrash album. The songs are a little simple. The riffs are fun. I like it. But it's one of those albums that over the years has just continued to grow on me more and more and more. And I've found it really does nothing wrong. Everything from the production to the songwriting to the ferocious performances are just so infectious and so engaging. This is just exactly what I want from Black and Thrash, and every time I listen to it, I feel like I love it even more. It's easily one of my favorite albums in the style, and my personal favorite Nocturnal album. This one goes right to the top. Alright, so the band would return in 2014 with the album Storming Evil. Before even getting to the music, I have to say I really love the cover art on this album. It kind of has like Army of Darkness vibes, or maybe like an old school tabletop game. Which I think is kind of fitting for the retro sound they got going on. Songwriting wise, though, this album is definitely a notable album in their discography because it feels like here they really took things to the next level. This is a much longer album than the prior albums. It's 46 minutes in length, whereas the two previous albums didn't even break the 40-minute mark. It also has just less of an underground feel to it. The songs here are longer, they're more developed, they have build-ups, longer guitar solos, and more obvious choruses. The prior albums had songs where they repeated sections, certainly, but here there's definitely parts where it's apparent what the chorus is in the song. Vocally, Tyrannizer delivers another amazing performance. She starts incorporating some really deadly shrieks that kind of remind me of Destruction, which I just love. And you hear all these elements right from the start with the song Storm from the Graves, which just has this extended build-up broken by a shriek, and then this really catchy halftime stomp just midway through that I just love. Much like Violent Revenge, there's a lot of fantastic tracks here. Rising Demons just has some racing riffs and an awesome chorus. Blessed Death is one of my favorite Nocturnal songs. One of the riffs here is just perfection. It sounds like Iron Maiden gone black and thrash, and every time I hear it, I just imagine charging into battle on horseback. I love it so much. Preaching Death is a cool song too. It's kind of got a bit more of an aggressive approach and a really cool lead in it too. I do have a couple quibbles with this album. A couple of the riffs here just feel a little messier, particularly on the song like Crushing the Bones, where one of the riffs just feels like a random jumble of notes that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Like with the previous albums, I do have a couple quibbles with individual songs. Taken by Fire, in particular, is a neat track. It's got a swaggering mid-tempo pace. It offers some good variety, but at 7 minutes long, it just feels like it overstays its welcome a little bit. I also do have to wonder here when I'm listening to this album if maybe the riff well was just running a little dry, because some of these riffs do sound a little similar to ones you heard on past albums. But there are exceptions to that for sure. Ripping Knives, for example, has these really high-pitched notes that don't really sound like anything I'd heard the band do before. Overall, this is another fantastic album from Nocturnal. They could have trimmed it a bit, but there's still so much terrific stuff here. This was one of my top albums of 2014, and I stand by that to this day. I still think it's a fantastic album. One of my personal favorite black thrash albums of the last 10 years, and my second favorite Nocturnal album overall. Alright, so Nocturnal would return in 2021 with the album Serpent Death. Definitely a different approach taken on this album. There's a totally new lineup here other than Avenger. The new vocalist, Invoker, has a much gruffer approach that almost sounds more like a shout. It's not bad, but it definitely, for me, pales in comparison to how Tyrannizer sounded on the two previous albums. And the songs here feel a lot more primitive, even more primitive than their previous albums. There's a lot of buzzing chords that almost remind me of like early Celtic Frost. And overall, that's fine, but the songwriting here just isn't quite as good as what you heard on their prior albums. Like Storming Evil, the songs are generally longer, and sometimes they're just unnecessarily long. The opening track, Black Ritual Tower, is a good example of that. It was a bold move kicking off the album with an 8-minute song, and it's an okay track. It's got some neat medieval sounding guitars, some cool melodic licks, but those ideas just aren't enough to carry the runtime. If they had cut this song to half its length and maybe put it elsewhere on the album, I think it could have worked. But I just don't think the ideas here are strong enough to justify an 8-minute runtime, and even if the track was shortened, I'm not sure it would be strong enough to be the opening track on the album. Circle of 13 is another slower song. It's got a bit of a mid-tempo approach. Again, some good variety coming from that approach, but also feels a little too long for me. Some of the other songs that aren't too long also just don't really do much for me. Beneath a Steel Sky, for example, just feels like filler. Not really anything that stands out about that track in my book. That being said, there are definitely some good songs here. Suppressive Fire just has this really fresh riff and more great leads to it. Damnator's Hand has a catchy chorus with some really great leads to it as well. And Void Dweller has some really high energy about it. It's a fast and short thrashy track with some call and response vocals I really like. I also think the album ends pretty strong. The closing track, The Iron Throne, is a pretty good track. The thing about this album is, though, is that all those songs I mentioned as highlights are in the second half, so this is definitely a backloaded album. But that being said, there are still some decent moments in the first half as well. From Terminal Death is an okay song. It's got some really wild riffs in the second half, including some really wild tremolo riffs, which I can't recall Nocturnal using much ever before. In terms of other positives, this is a really great production job on this album. It's very old school, but everything still sounds clear and distinguishable. The guitar solos, again, are really good on this album. And, you know, overall, if they had dropped a few songs from Serpent Death, maybe shortened a couple tracks, this definitely would have been closer to their other albums in terms of quality, although probably still not quite as good. All that being said, I still do like this album. It's one of those albums where I enjoy it when I listen to it, even if I do have things that bother me about it. And I feel like I was constantly on the fence about whether I wanted a physical copy or not, because I wasn't sure if I liked it enough to own it on vinyl. But after re-listening to their discography for this video, I realized I did enjoy it enough for that, so I actually did buy a physical copy. So that certainly says something, I think. Still not quite as good as their other stuff, but a good album overall, a good Blackened Thrash album that I think any Blackened Thrash fan would definitely get some enjoyment out of. Overall, Nocturnal has such a great style, and Avenger seems like such a devoted Blackened Thrash fan. He runs Death Strike Records. He also has a public Spotify playlist that he updates fairly regularly with underground black thrash songs. He has some other projects as well that I enjoy, most notably Sacrifiction, who released a terrific EP last year that is just awesome. It kind of has the same primitive approach as Serpent Death, but with really great songs on it. Really excited to hear what that band does next. And I'm definitely still excited to hear what Nocturnal does next too, even if Serpent Death definitely wasn't my favorite of theirs. But yeah, that does it for this video, guys. If you like this video, please drop me a like, please subscribe. And if you want to hear me talk about more Blackened Thrash, check out this video where I rank the albums of the Colombian black thrash band Witch Trap. But that's all for now. I will see you guys next time. Stay heavy.